Hey everybody, Matt here for Imagine Then Make. Thanks for stopping by. Well, this is part 10 of my series of videos teaching complete beginners how to program in Python. If you missed any of the earlier episodes, just check the video description for some links. Okay, at the end of the last video, I talked about the data validation routine that I built for the simple guessing game program. In today's video, we're going to integrate that data validation program into the simple guessing game program. So what I have right here on the screen is the source code for the last version of the guessing game without any data validation. So just to remind everybody how this actually works, let's go ahead and run this program. Okay, so we got some simple print statements here. We're at an input command right here. So I'm going to guess a number between 0 and 100 inclusive. So I typically guess 50. Oh, look at that. I guessed the correct number. That's never happened in all the times I've tested this game. So let's try it again. Okay, so I'll guess 50 again. And it says my guess is too high, guess a smaller number. So it got all the way down to this section in the code, and then it circled around to the while loop. We talked about that in earlier episodes ad nausea. So we'll type in another number here. My guess is too high, so we'll split the difference between 50 and 0. So we'll type in 25. Guess is still too high. We'll type in, I don't know, 15. Guess is too high. Let's type in 10. Guess is too low. So our number that we're trying to get is between 10 and 15. So let's guess 13. That's too low. Let's get 14. And there we go. And it says you needed 6 tries to guess the correct number, which is right down here in the source code. So let's just run it one more time and see what the program does if we type in some invalid numbers. Okay, so guess the number. I'm just going to press the enter key. It says my guess is too low, which is interesting because I actually didn't even press in any numbers. Let's try 120. My guess is too low, guess a larger number. Again, it doesn't seem like it understands what's going on. Let's type in some letters. Guess is too high, guess a smaller number. So you can see that there's a real need for data validation. Let's type in a valid number. Okay, it says my guess is too low, guess is too high. So now I know the number I'm trying to get is between 50 and 75. So despite all these invalid entries, the program kept running. It didn't crash, but it really didn't behave the way I intended it to. So let's just see if we can finish this game. I type in 65, that's too high, 60, that's too high, 55, that's too high, 52. Look, there you go. So, and here we are at a Python prompt. So the program still runs. This version of it, it still runs. The problem is that it's not validating any of the input. So in the next what we're going to talk about is adding data validation to this source code. Okay, so we'll talk about that next. All right, so here's the source code I just demonstrated, and here's the data validation code that I wrote and explained in the previous episode. So in this episode, what I want to do is integrate or merge this code right here, and the data validation code, into the guess the number game right here. And you can see that I have added a comment in the source code for the guess the number game that the data validation, or I called it input checking code, needs to go right here. Now, I'd love to say that I could just do a copy and paste and put it right in here, but no, it doesn't work that way. It could have worked that way had I thought that far in advance, but I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So this needs to go into that program. So here is what I came up with. Okay, and so basically with the same beginning portion all the way down to the while loop. And then I have a comment here that explains that the data validation code starts right here. A few comments as to what my intentions were when I wrote this code. And then here are the 1, 2, 3 tests of the data validation code. And then assuming that the user input made a guess, guessed a number that passes all 3 of these tests, then the code goes down to here and decides whether the guess is too high, too low, or matches the random number that the computer generated. So in 1 second, I'm going to run this code and we'll see how it performs. All right, so let's go ahead and run the program here. And first we'll enter in some valid inputs just to verify that it works if you enter in good data. So, and just as, I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but I did reactivate this print statement right here. I just removed the pound sign, so it's no longer a comment. So I am printing the random number out to the screen just so we can see what it is. Again, we're kind of in testing / development mode. All right, so here I am sitting at the input line, which is right here. So let's type in a valid input. Normally I would type in 50. Your guess is too low. So type in 75. That's too low. I type in, I don't know, maybe 85. That's too high. So now we know it should be between 85 and 75. Let's type in 80. That's too low. Let's type in 83, and there we go. Okay, so if we type in valid numbers, we know the code still works, even though we've made a whole bunch of edits to it by integrating or adding to the original source code all this data validation code. Okay, so in all cases, when we typed in valid data, it passed test 1, test 2, and test 3, and then got down to this lower section of the code where it decides whether or not the guess was too high or too low or matched. Okay, so we know that that part works. Now let's try running the program again, only typing in some invalid entries. So once again, we're printing out the random number. This time it happens to be 82. It's interesting. It's only one number different. Kind of interesting. Okay, so let's see. The first invalid thing we'll enter in is we'll just press the enter key. So in other words, we won't make a guess. Okay, and the program says, invalid guess, please make your guess between 0 and 100. And so if we look at the code, right, it came down here, the input statement, we pressed enter, right, at this line. It incremented the number of guesses because I did make the executive decision to increase the number of guesses even if the guesses are invalid. Okay, it's not a queue, so it got past test 1. Test 2, it failed, however, because we didn't type in any numbers. So remember, all of this code is indented underneath the while loop, and because this failed, this test 2 failed, it printed invalid guess, and it also set, more importantly, valid underscore input to false. Okay, so then it got down to here, it circled back up to the while loop, and it checked to see if valid underscore input is absolutely equal to false. Yes, and we know what it is because it was just set to false here. So let's type in some letters this time. Something kind of random. We got the same kind of response because test number 2 once again failed because we didn't type in any numbers. Okay, so it failed here. It made sure valid underscore input was set to false. It printed our line of comment here, our print statement, and then it circled back around to the while loop. Valid underscore input is still absolutely equal to false, so it enters the while loop again. Now let's guess a number that's greater than 100, all right? So outside the maximum allowable. So we'll type in 120. And guess what? We got the same sort of message. Invalid guess. Please make your guess between 0 and 100. Okay, so this time it wasn't a Q. We know that. So it passed test number 1. This time we entered in all numbers, right? Because we entered in 120. So it got past test number 2, but it failed the test number 3 because our guess is not between 0 and 100 inclusive. So it skipped the if part and it ran the else part where it set the valid underscore input still to false, and it printed this line right here. Okay, so now we've made, let's see, 1, 2, 3 invalid guesses. Okay, so now let's try and make valid guesses and see if we can complete the game. So normally I would type in 50. This time the guess is too low, so I type in 75. Guess is too low, so I type in 85. Guess is too high, so I'm between 75 and 85. So guess 80. That's too low. Let's guess 83. That's too high. 82, and there it is. And you see I've got 9 guesses. So here was where I pressed enter. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and on the 9th guess, I guessed the correct number. Okay, so that seems to be working. Let's run one more time. Only this time, let's type in the letter Q. And at that point, it says, thanks for playing. So up here in the code, at the input statement, we typed in the lowercase q. The number of guesses was incremented. We looked at test number 1. It does equal q, so test valid underscore input was set to true. And then we broke out of this while loop. It goes down here. It checks again. So kind of redundant, not real good form, but this is how far we've gotten so far. If guess underscore num absolutely equals q, then print thanks for playing, which is what it did, and then it breaks the program, and there we have the Python prompt. Okay, so this seems to be working. What I was trying to illustrate is in the last video, we created a separate piece of code that just was focused on data validation and not the actual running of the game. And then in this episode, we merged what was in the data validation code that was written in the last episode with the code that was already written for the guess the number game, okay? And as I mentioned, it could have been written in a slightly different way, which we really haven't talked about, but I'll just kind of introduce you to the idea. If you're already an experienced programmer, you're probably yelling at the screen like, why didn't I do it this way in the first place? So all of this code right here, these 3 tests, the data validation code, right? All of this could have been written in a separate function or block of code and maybe named something simple like data underscore validation. And to that code, I could have passed or sent input the value of guess the underscore num, and basically sending the contents of this variable to that separate function to run these tests, and then depending on what the outcome of those 3 tests was, either return valid underscore input being set to true or being set to false. So I could have done that, but instead I chose to keep the data validation code at the same level as the actual game code. So you could see it, it's sort of all in line. So it's hopefully a little bit easier to read, but it's not perfect programming form. But hey, as a beginner, I think that's okay. You're still learning how to code. The idea is to write something that you could read a month later and understand what you did and also have the code run correctly. Now I'd like to start talking about a couple of different ways you could test your code, and we'll talk about that in the next video.